As we move into a few moments of silence and meditation, we remember this great lesson from Olympia Brown. We can never make the world safe by fighting. Every nation must learn that the people of all nations are children of God and must share the wealth of the world. You may say that this is impracticable, far away, can never be accomplished, but it is the work we are appointed to do. Sometime, somehow, somewhere, we must teach this great lesson. Because the central task of a religious community is to unveil the bonds that bind us all. May we, in our silence, connect to all that is pure, to all that must be done for justice, to all that must be done to prepare to make this world a better place, action by action. So be it. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry shares, "We live not by things, but by the meaning of things. It is needful to transmit the passwords from generation to generation." And so, what are we transporting and transmitting in our passwords of images and meanings from generation to generation? For example, when we see the giant mushroom cloud hovering over a landscape, we remember that we do not have the luxury of living in the land of denial. On August 6, 1945, Hiroshima Day remembers the nuclear bomb that destroyed the city, and between 90 and 166,000 people died. And on August 9th, 1945, the second nuclear blast hit Nagasaki, and it left more vast and mass destruction than our planet had ever known. Yes, some say this ended World War II and was necessary, and others would change the nuclear science and physics that had gone too far, according to some, and humans had made a devastating mistake. But we cannot live in the land of denial. A friend, Greg Franzik, explains about Hiroshima that denial is a gift, and our minds do it for us to help us go on, move into this place of denial. But an excess virtue soon can be a vice. Facing horror is difficult but necessary, isn't it? To paraphrase the Irish, 'tis best to look the devil in the eye than to have it put with his deeds evermore upon you. And yet again, avoiding an excessive preoccupation with darkness. Our minds give us another gift, and that gift is hope. Thinking of that traditional Japanese folk song that we will hear at the end of our service, Sakura, Yayoi no so rawa, Aizaya, Aizaya, Mini yu Kakanan, cherry blossoms, pink profusion fills the air, covering Hiroshima's plain, and come and see, it will not long remain. And so some years ago, when Greg attended a service on August 6th in a Unitarian church in Ashland, Oregon, there was a guest speaker. This university professor explained that Hiroshima, Japan, was a place of devastation, and the days before had just been a place of beauty. And so after that talk, he looked in the gray hymnal, and it showed him that there was a song and lyrics on one of the pages in tribute to that day. The university professor smiled, and quite unexpectedly he started to sing it, and the two of us joined in song. And now every year, August 6th, Greg thinks of that university professor, and he cries and smiles and hopes. And Antoine de Saint-Exupéry reminds us again, we live not by things, but by the meaning of things. It is needful to transmit the passwords from generation to generation. In the United States, we hear music and we see Confederate flags, and we remember we live not by things, but the meaning of things. So some say that the Confederate flag stands for the Southern culture, and others say that that same symbol stands for oppression of blacks. Some would say that the lyrics from Dixieland share meaning of the slaves longing for the plantation that they were born on, and others hear the lack of freedom imposed on slaves for decades. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. But no, today we don't look away, but we wake up. Yes, we become woke. A phrase from Rumi to the Black Lives Matter and more. To paraphrase Rumi's warning, wake up. Do not go back to sleep, or we will miss what is in the garden. We will miss what is fully in our lives. And recently, the blacks in our country have invited us to be woke to the injustices of our time, to start in the conversation in a different way rather than an argument about which lives matter, and know that when we say Black Lives Matter, it must be heard in that way, because black lives are being threatened more on our streets and through the COVID pandemic and more than any other group of people. Wake now my senses, wake now my reason, reach out to the new. Join with each pilgrim that quests for the true. Honor the beauty and the wisdom of time. Suffer thy limit and praise the sublime. Those words from our opening hymn, sublime, meaning of such excellence, grandeur, of beauty to inspire great admiration or awe. As a verb, it means chemistry of a solid substance that changes directly into a vapor when heated, typically forming a solid deposit again upon cooling. And the other meaning is to elevate to a higher degree of moral or spiritual purity or excellence. And so, think of that, a chemistry of a solid substance. It changes into a vapor, maybe explodes into a protest when heated, maybe even explodes into violence that we're not sure how we can understand or control. But typical of forming a solid deposit, once it cools again, it becomes solid. So this verse, referring to the sublime, also refers to our topic today of looking at symbols. Statues have been removed from Stonewall Jackson in Virginia to Christopher Columbus and more around the country, trying to remove the reminders of those historical figures who represent systematic racism and oppression to many and other historical figures of worth. So, Saint Antoine Exupéry says to us, we live not by things but by the meaning of things. It is needful to transmit those passwords from generation to generation, all participating fully in what Edward O. Wilson would have called social biology, the new synthesis, in his 1975 book. We see here natural selection in process. We are seeing how natural selection is influencing human behavior. It is not a neat or a tidy process. Will each person react the same way to changes in our country? No. Is there a wide spectrum of responses from oppression that needs to be changed through systems of racism that have served many at the cost of even more for so many years? There's a wide spectrum of responses. You see, Wilson believed that there was such a thing as human nature, that human nature constrains the range of what we can achieve when raising our children or designing our new social systems. So the constraints of that range of what we can achieve at the highest is put into place as we raise our children and design those institutions, from schools to churches to clubs, etc. Wilson was well acquainted with rationalization of theorizing about rights and justice due to his shared work at Harvard with Lawrence Kohlberg and John Rawls as philosophers. He saw those rationalizations generating into justifications for moral intuitions that were best explained by evolution. Do people believe in human rights because such rights actually exist, like mathematical truths, sitting on a cosmic shelf next to theorems and waiting to be discovered by other reasoners? Or do people feel revulsion and sympathy when they react to accounts of torture and then invent a story about human rights to justify their feelings. And so, in other words, what stories do we create to rationalize our feelings and our actions? Wilson sided with Hume. He shared and charged that moral philosophers were really doing was fabricating justifications after consulting emotive centers of their own brains. And so depending on what your brain would react to, the justifications and the rationalizations come in. He predicted that the study of ethics would soon be taken out of the halls of the philosophers and turned into biology, or made it into an emerging science of human nature. Such a linkage of philosophy and biology and evolution would be an example to the new synthesis that Wilson dreamed of. And later he referred to that as a consilience, a jumping together of ideas to create one unified body of knowledge. Some called him a racist, some called him a fascist because of his ideas, and some called him a prophet of moral psychology. So you start seeing here in this explanation of Professor Wilson a range, a spectrum of responses to what he was describing as the human biology moving and changing, becoming a part of evolution, changing with each individual. Eventually, moral psychology moved from being about evolved emotions to a development of reasoning and information processing. The Righteous Mind book, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion, gives more fascinating breakdowns of how our minds and our groups of who we agree with and who we are in conflict are literally changing the evolution of humankind. Starting in May 2020, there were demonstrations over the police killing of George Floyd. He, for almost 9 minutes, could not breathe at the knee of a police officer. And since then, there have been protests in Portland, and they began as peaceful, but then they started to involve vandalism and injury and arson and looting, and then heated confrontations with the police. In early July, the federal government sent in law enforcement, and we watch this played out on the news nightly as updates are given. And then all over the country, from Minneapolis to Chicago to New York, Los Angeles, and Detroit, we have seen reports that what has happened is that there is a spectrum, again, of responses. The Antifa, that loose coalition of self-described anti-fascist activists, years of conflict with law enforcement are being played out. People are dying, people are getting hurt, there is violence and there is looting, and there also is peaceful protesting. The whole spectrum plays out for us to be part of as we watch and have opinions and participate as we will. For each of us, if we could take a moment and think of what is the most horrible event that happened in our life. Was it a personal assault or abuse in a situation? Or was it such an oppressor that oppressed our ancestors, such as Cromwell oppressing the Irish, or Hitler or Mussolini? Or was it the mushroom cloud that represented Hiroshima? Or is it this COVID situation? Why do we see people ripping down statues? How would we feel if we were going to drive by symbols daily that reminded us of the most violent, worst examples of humankind that had caused destruction in our personal life? how would we feel? What would that bring to mind? The oppression and the assault that was symbolized by a statue, a general, or what you would see on the street in a statue. We took down the German wall. They removed statues of Saddam Hussein. Why do we want our streets in America lined with symbolic statues of war generals? Do they belong elsewhere? Do they belong in a museum? How should we move them? What kind of respectful and teaching ceremonies could we create to remove them without this violence? I'm not sure. The questions continue, and in the meantime, the actions continue as well. We live not by things, but the meaning of things. It is needful to transmit the passwords from generation to generation. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry reminds us. So, how can we ceremoniously remove something that was oppressive to a people for decades? What are the alternatives to looting and violence? How can we do conflict resolution at a grand scale without people dying on our streets? Have you ever dealt with someone personally or in a crowd that has gone beyond the breaking point? What was your approach in dealing with them? These questions are the questions we need to ask one another. What does a symbol on a flag mean to you? What does it mean to me? It may be very different. And so, as Baruch Spinoza reminds us from 1676, I have striven not to laugh at human actions, and not to weep with them, and not to hate them, but to understand them. May we continue to unfold and unpeel our understandings that go deeper and deeper into the crisis of our times, not just COVID, but the racism that must be broken down and changed. What is happening and what processes can we invoke and encourage so that we can live not by things, but by the meaning of things. It is needful for each of us to think before we transmit the passwords from generation to generation. May each of us give this more thought and understanding as the news changes on a daily basis. Namaste.